The 6th of December in 1944 saw a wind that swept across the prairie lands of the Midwest, carrying with it the harshness of winter, sharp and unyielding. As the train shuddered to a standstill near the perimeter of a prisoner of war installation in Iowa, its metal wheels groaned against the tracks with a final tremor. Inside, the women, clad in garments insufficient for the biting cold, clutched their arms more tightly across their bodies. They had been forewarned of cruelty. Back in Germany, propaganda flyers had promised just that. Captured females would face scorn, humiliation, forced servitude, or something far worse. Many of these young auxiliary personnel exchanged fearful whispers as they pressed their faces against the frosted glass windows, straining to catch a glimpse of their fate in America. What they observed, however, disturbed them for reasons they could not yet articulate. Beyond the enclosing wire mesh, rows of unadorned wooden barracks stretched out, their rooftops blanketed with snow. Sentries in thick overcoats stamped their feet against the frigid air. A kitchen chimney sent plumes of white vapor into the pallid December sky. In the distance, fields of dormant corn stood in silent testimony, a spectral reminder that this was farmland, not a theater of war. For some of the women, this was the first tranquil vista they had witnessed in years. Yet, the profound quietude only intensified their disquiet. Among them was a 23-year-old nurse taken captive near Ayen as the Allied forces advanced toward the Rhine. Her name is lost to the official records, but a single line in her later diary would encapsulate that day. I set foot on American soil, anticipating shackles, but the only weight I felt was the thumping of my own heart. That heart pounded fiercely as she and her companions were ordered to form a line on the platform. They were weary from their Atlantic voyage, their bodies still lurching with the phantom motion of the ship and the weeks of hushed confinement during their transit. Not a soul spoke as boots crunched on ice, ushering them into formation. Officers barked commands in English, a language understood by few. A translator relayed them in German, in a tone that was already calm, almost civil. This was perplexing. Back home, Americans had been portrayed as savages with daggers clenched between their teeth, purveyors of chaos who would exhibit no clemency. Yet here, the directives lacked any trace of the animosity they had anticipated. The guards seemed more apathetic than malevolent, shifting their rifles in gloved hands, as if eager only to return to the warmth of their quarters. Nevertheless, the women braced themselves. Rumors circulated that prisoner camps in the Soviet Union were tantamount to death sentences. Surely the Americans, their adversaries, would not differ significantly. They braced for jeers, for indignities, for the stripping away of their dignity. Instead, they were led in an orderly, brisk fashion toward a building from which the robust aroma of coffee wafted. Coffee. This surprised them more profoundly than an aggressive shout would have. Many had not tasted this beverage in months. In Germany, it had become a luxury, frequently supplanted by roasted barley or acorns. Yet here, in the custody of their enemy, the rich fragrance promised a familiarity they found difficult to trust. A United States Army report from that winter notes the arrival of a cohort of female auxiliaries, numbering around 50, and describes their physical state as fatigued but healthy. The report makes no reference to fear, nor does it acknowledge the way these women's eyes darted at every movement, every open door. To the officers, they were merely individuals to be processed, another item on an ever-expanding war ledger. But to the women, every action carried weight. When an American soldier held a doorway open for them, they paused, uncertain if it was a ruse. When he gestured again, with a hint of impatience but no discernible unkindness, they shuffled inside, their boots squeaking against the wooden floor. Within, a comforting warmth enveloped their faces. The barracks carried a faint scent of soap and boiled potatoes. Long tables were laid with tin cups and waiting plates. A volunteer from the Red Cross, her hair concealed beneath a wool cap, stood nearby, distributing blankets. She offered a smile, a gesture so commonplace it nearly overcame one of the younger prisoners, who bit her lip to stifle tears. This simple act of kindness felt perilous, as if accepting it meant betraying everything she had been told about the adversary. It was in this very moment that their preconceived notions began to fracture. The women had steeled themselves for barbarity. Instead, they found themselves disarmed by courtesy. This too served as a form of armament, though they did not recognize it at the time. The United States, unlike many warring nations, had publicly committed to upholding the Geneva Convention of 1929. Prisoners of war were to be provided sustenance, shelter, and the liberty to correspond with their families. The Germans had also affixed their signatures to this accord, yet frequently disregarded its stipulations. Now, these women were confronting the unexpected reality of Americans adhering to it, even extending its provisions beyond the strict letter of the law. One prisoner later penned, "They provided us with beds and clean linens. I thought of my brother on the Eastern Front, sleeping in frozen mud, and I could not comprehend why the enemy treated us with more kindness than our own leaders treated him." This bewilderment cut deeper than any insult could have. For women who had absorbed years of relentless propaganda, the camp represented an unsettling revelation, yet suspicion persisted. Perhaps this solicitousness was fleeting, a cruel jest before the true retribution commenced. Perhaps the Americans were nurturing them for some undisclosed objective. The guards spoke sparingly. The translators offered no reassurances beyond the established regulations of camp existence. Work assignments, curfews, and morning counts were communicated with clarity. All else remained shrouded in mystery. Darkness descended swiftly in those Midwestern winters, enshrouding the camp in a silence punctuated only by the crunch of sentry patrols and the low sigh of wind against barbed wire. The women lay awake on their cots, listening, anticipating. Some murmured prayers, others gazed at the ceiling, envisioning the aerial bombardment striking their distant hometowns. A few clutched photographs, their creases softened by repeated handling of the visages of husbands and brothers they might never behold again. In those initial nights, they remained prisoners not only of the confines of the camp, but also of their own escalating dread. Yet, memory possesses a remarkable tenacity. Even in the ensuing weeks as daily routines became established, the recollection of that first arrival lingered. The rising steam from the coffee, the warmth of the blanket, the volunteer's gentle smile. These sensory details clashed starkly with the pronouncements of cruelty they had been compelled to believe. And beneath that dissonance lay a nascent seed, fragile yet undeniable, the possibility that their enemy was not the monstrous entity they had been indoctrinated to fear. What they could not yet grasp was how this seed would be nurtured, how it would flourish in the most improbable of circumstances. For within the kitchens of these camps, amidst the flour, sugar, and apples gathered from nearby farms, the Americans were preparing something far more unusual than disciplinary measures or interrogations. They were preparing hospitality, conveyed not through words, but through tastes. The women had braced themselves for physical assault. Instead, they would be offered a measure of compassion disguised as a sweet confection. And when that moment arrived, it would profoundly shake them more than the thunderous clamor of any battlefield. The mornings at the camp commenced not with cries or blows, but with the resonant clang of a bell. The women stirred beneath their woolen blankets, the air sharp with the mingled scents of soap, cold wood smoke, and damp timber. For some, the initial days were the most arduous, not due to any mistreatment, but because of the disorienting absence of it. They had anticipated darkness and confinement. Yet, what they discovered was order, routine, and a peculiar form of normalcy that unsettled them more than any overt brutality ever could. They filed out of the barracks into the winter chill, their exhaled breath forming clouds like smoke against the pale horizon. Guards, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, counted them with practiced speed, their demeanor suggesting a sense of routine rather than engagement. The women, still wary, kept their gazes lowered, expecting at any moment for the facade to crumble. But the facade remained intact. Instead, they were escorted toward the mess hall, where the air was warm and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread emanated from the ovens. A German nurse later confessed that she had wept at the sight of butter gracing the tables. In her hometown, such abundance had vanished long before her capture. The camp was no haven of freedom. It was enclosed, patrolled, governed by regulations. Liberty was extinguished, but within those imposed boundaries, life unfolded with far less savagery than they had envisioned. Each barrack contained rows of simple wooden bunks, mattresses filled with straw, and lockers for personal belongings. There were communal washing facilities, though the water often ran frigid, and designated classrooms where American officers encouraged the pursuit of language acquisition. Some of the women reacted to this with bitter amusement, remarking that learning English was merely preparing them for defeat. Nevertheless, a significant number attended, driven by curiosity, drawn to the novelty of books and chalk when the external world was in turmoil. An official United States Army ration report from 1944 indicates that prisoners of war were allocated nearly the same daily caloric intake as American soldiers, encompassing items such as beans, potatoes, canned meats, bread, margarine, and sugar. Coffee was dispensed, albeit weekly, leading to predictable murmurs of complaint. One diary entry preserved from a German auxiliary stationed in Texas reads, "They serve us coffee akin to water, but at least it is warm." The irony was not lost on her. She grumbled about the diluted strength of the enemy's coffee, while her family back home was boiling acorns for sustenance. It was in such stark contrasts that the women's confusion deepened. They had anticipated that the Americans would strip them of their dignity. Instead, they found themselves treated with a politeness that, in its very civility, felt almost cruel. Directives from the War Department served as reminders to camp commandants that adherence to the Geneva Convention was not a matter of discretion. Yet, beyond the codified rules, there existed an intangible element, something deeply ingrained in the culture. In the evenings, church groups from neighboring towns would occasionally visit, their voices rising in hymns sung in English, the melodies drifting over the fences. The women listened in silent contemplation, experiencing a mixture of comfort and unease. For these songs of compassion emanated from those they had been instructed to believe were utterly merciless. Some adapted with remarkable speed. They engaged in sowing. They cultivated gardens and spring plots situated within the camp's confines. They even staged theatrical performances for one another, utilizing salvaged fabric and rudimentary props. Others found the dissonance unbearable. A 30-year-old prisoner is documented as having stated, "Every act of kindness is a wound. My brothers suffer from starvation, and they offer me bread." She began to refuse meals, consuming only the bare minimum as if determined to prove she could still endure hardship for the sake of Germany. However, the body often rebels against the will, and before long, she too was observed dipping her bread into the weak yet fragrant coffee, savoring what she found impossible to resist. The guards observed these contradictions. Some chuckled softly amongst themselves, remarking on the peculiar sight of enemy captives bickering over the richness of soup, while American families diligently rationed sugar and meat for the war effort. "We are treating them better than our own men," one sergeant remarked, not without a trace of bitterness. And indeed, the government allocated approximately $160 per day for the sustenance of each prisoner, at times exceeding the allocation for a United States infantryman engaged in combat in the Ardennes. War invariably presents its absurdities, and this was certainly one of them. The women began to establish routines, morning roll calls, assignments to work in the kitchens or laundries, brief strolls within the inner courtyard. The winter sun glinted off the barbed wire, causing it to sparkle deceptively, like festive tinsel. They offered nervous laughter at the sight, a form of mockery tinged with a secret yearning for home. Some etched calendars onto the wooden walls, marking the passage of days with small crosses. Others penned letters on the thin paper provided by the Red Cross, though their replies often took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Yet, despite the pervasive order, suspicion lingered. What if this kindness was merely a temporary facade? What if it was a lure, a guise concealing a more sinister agenda? This notion festered, born of fear and persistent propaganda, but gradually it began to loosen its grip. The longer they resided within the camp, the more the reality diverged from the nightmarish images they had transported across the ocean. There were no beatings, no starvation, no public humiliation. Instead, there were rules, routines, the monotonous struggle for survival, and beneath it all, a disquieting truth. They were being treated as human beings. This truth left many feeling unsettled. It was far simpler to harbor hatred for an enemy when he was perceived as a monster. It became considerably more challenging when he was a man with a distinct accent, a guard who surreptitiously provided them with extra sugar packets, or a chaplain who offered prayers for their families back in Europe. One of the younger women confessed to another, her voice a mere whisper beneath her blanket late at night. "I no longer know how to hate them, and if I cannot hate them, then what remains for me?" The question hung heavy in the air, unanswerable. Not all moments were characterized by gentleness. Fights erupted amongst the prisoners themselves, fueled by rumors, underlying rivalries, or sheer despair. One evening, a dispute over a letter escalated to the point where guards intervened. However, even then, the consequence was a stern admonishment, not the brutal reprisal they had anticipated. Gradually, their perception of the enemy began to erode. Slowly, they started to discern fissures in the narratives they had been fed. The snow melted, spring approached, and gardens began to sprout within the protective wire fencing. Women knelt in the soil, planting seeds with hands that had once tended to the wounded on battlefields. The irony was not lost upon them. They had crossed an ocean as captives, yet here they were, coaxing life from American soil. They lived in confinement, but for some, it felt akin to their first unburdened breath after years of suffocating warfare. Still, the central enigma persisted. Why? Why would Americans expend resources to treat enemy women with such consideration when their own sons were perishing overseas? The women pondered this endlessly, each passing day deepening the mystery. And though the explanation was multifaceted, incorporating elements of law, cultural norms, and strategic considerations, its most impactful manifestation was yet to be revealed. For just beyond the kitchens, the unmistakable scent of something sweet began to waft. Flour, sugar, butter, and apples were being transformed by local hands into a dish that was both commonplace and extraordinary. The women could not yet fathom it, but soon they would be invited to partake. And when that moment arrived, the ingrained beliefs they had carried across the sea would be shaken in ways no prison fence could ever contain. It began with an aroma, sweet, warm, and utterly distinctive. The scent of apples baked with cinnamon and sugar, drifting through the mess hall like a cherished memory of home. The women lifted their gazes from their tin trays, their eyes flicking toward the kitchen door, as if the fragrance itself were a fabrication of their imagination. Many had not encountered fruit in months. In Germany, by the close of 1944, apples were a rarity, either hoarded or shriveled specimens procured from vendors. To detect their scent here, in captivity, felt akin to being taunted by the specter of childhood. Some stiffened with suspicion. Others closed their eyes, allowing the fragrance to momentarily transport them elsewhere. The door swung open, and what entered was more astonishing than any rumor they had carried across the Atlantic. Not soldiers, not guards, but women in heavy winter coats. American church volunteers, their cheeks flushed pink from the cold, carefully balancing laden trays covered with golden-crusted pies. Their boots squeaked a familiar tune on the floorboards as they placed them on the serving table. They offered hesitant smiles, uncertain whether to meet the prisoners' gazes. The German women stared back, momentarily stunned into silence. One whispered, almost to herself, "Why would they waste such food on us?" A guard cleared his throat, seemingly uncomfortable with the stillness, and gestured for the distribution to commence. A slice was placed onto each tray. Flaky pastry, warm apples, and a subtle hint of butter that melted into the tin plate. The prisoners hesitated, forks hovered, hands trembled. They had prepared themselves for hunger, for chastisement, not for this unexpected sweetness. To taste it felt like capitulation. Yet, hunger often holds sway over pride. Slowly, cautiously, they raised the initial morsels to their mouths. What transpired then could never have been captured in the official reports, which merely record that local women's groups delivered baked goods to the detainees. However, in private journals and subsequent testimonies, that singular moment reappears repeatedly. A 20-year-old Luftwaffe auxiliary recounted it in a letter penned years later. "I bit into that pie, and it was as if the war receded for a single heartbeat. I remembered my grandmother's kitchen, the way she cooled her pies on the windowsill. I did not wish to remember, but the taste compelled me to. For others, the sweetness was overwhelming. One prisoner set her fork down and began to weep silently, her shoulders shaking without a sound. Another muttered indignantly that this was a calculated tactic, a means to pacify them, to make them forget the men perishing in Europe. Yet, even she, by the conclusion of the meal, had consumed her entire slice. The body craves what the heart resists. The irony was not lost on the guards, who exchanged knowing glances. They assumed we would lash them, one private later commented. And here we were, feeding them pie. Perhaps that's the most effective propaganda we ever deployed. His observation was not entirely inaccurate. The War Department actively promoted humane treatment, not solely to comply with the Geneva Convention, but also to serve as living refutations to Nazi claims of American barbarity. In that mess hall, the strategy was yielding results in ways far more intimate than any leaflet disseminated from aircraft. The German women did not trust easily. Even as they licked cinnamon from the edges of their forks, they questioned the underlying motive. Were the pies poisoned? Were they intended as a form of humiliation? But the Americans ate from the same trays, their faces alight with smiles, their fingers sticky, wiping crumbs from their chins. The volunteers spoke softly in rudimentary German, or communicated through the universal language of gestures, inquiring about families, offering second helpings to those who dared to meet their eyes. In one corner, the nurse who had first disembarked from the train weeks earlier found herself contemplating the pastry in her hand. She had anticipated confinement, then discovered blankets, expected starvation, then found stew. Now she expected nothing, yet here was a gift she could not comprehend. She took a bite, closed her eyes, and in that instant, her memories betrayed her. She saw her mother dusting flour across a wooden table, her younger sister licking sugar from her fingertip. She had spent years consuming hatred, nourishing herself on slogans. Yet here, in the hands of the enemy, came a taste that disarmed her more effectively than any projectile. Not every woman succumbed so readily. Some pushed the pie aside, untouched, stubbornly resisting the temptation. But even their defiance felt hollow, for the aroma permeated the room, seeping into every inhalation. It was more than just sustenance. It was a symbol. It was a weapon. It was a paradox. The sweetness compelled them to confront the truth they had been cautioned against. The enemy could indeed be merciful. A United States chaplain who had accompanied the church women later recalled, "My mother always advised, feed them pie, not hatred. Show them who we truly are." I was uncertain if it would make a difference, but when I witnessed the expressions on those girls' faces, I knew something had fundamentally shifted. He was correct. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but it was undeniably real. Some prisoners hastily scribbled notes that evening, recording the experience in coded language to evade censors. One wrote, "The enemy's most potent weapon is butter." Another confessed that she had dreamt of pies cooling on her grandmother's windowsill, a dream more comforting than any she had allowed herself since the war commenced. The simple dessert had unsettled them more profoundly than hunger ever could. There was also humor, albeit in hushed tones. One woman jested that perhaps the Americans intended to fatten them, rendering them incapable of escape should an opportunity arise. Another teased that the crust was excessively thick, suggesting her mother's recipe was superior. Laughter, tentative and fragile, broke the silence that had enveloped the barracks for weeks. The sound of it was startling, joy emerging from captivity. But beneath the laughter lay a disquieting unease. For what did it signify if the enemy exhibited kindness? What did it imply if the very hands that held rifles could also offer pie? If America was not the barbaric behemoth they had been conditioned to despise, then what other narratives had been fabricated? That inquiry persisted like a residual flavor, long after the final morsels vanished. While the groundskeepers tidied the hall and assistants collected their dinnerware, the women retreated to their sleeping quarters, their bellies full but their spirits unsettled. A few remained awake, replaying the sensation, caught between appreciation and remorse. Others resolutely refused, vowing never to yield to sugary temptations. Yet, such defiance proved fragile, as each bite had delivered not merely a pleasant taste, but an implicit invitation to reevaluate their perception of the adversary. This wasn't just sustenance, it was ideology encased in a flaky crust. America articulating, without uttering a single word, "We shall confront you with military might, but we shall also extend compassion." And compassion, in its subtle influence, presented a far greater challenge to resist than any form of outright theft. These women could not yet comprehend the profound and lasting impact of this juncture, how its resonance would echo through the years following the war's conclusion, when some would return to desolate homelands, while others would find themselves yearning for the peculiar civility of their confinement. For the present, their sole understanding was that their training in all the prevailing propaganda had utterly failed to prepare them for this reality, and the true astonishment was yet to arrive. For if a simple apple pie could erode their certainty in long-held falsehoods, what awaited them in the war's concluding chapters would completely dismantle those convictions. By the spring of 1945, the perimeter fencing no longer felt like confinement so much as a distant boundary. The women still awoke to the persistent clang of the morning bell and still assembled for the daily roll call under the vigilant gaze of their keepers. However, an indefinable element had transformed. They had arrived anticipating animosity, only to discover instead the unyielding rhythm of respect. They had savored apple pie in the mess hall, and their deeply held beliefs had begun to tremble. Now, as whispers of Germany's impending collapse filtered through fragmented letters and hushed radio transmissions, the captives realized their internment was reshaping them in unforeseen ways. The medic, who had once prepared herself for shackles, now found herself instructing her sleeping companions in English phrases, amused by the awkward way American words formed on their tongues. The 30-year-old woman, who had previously rejected meals as a protest against the suffering of her countrymen, now dedicated her afternoons to cultivating a garden within the enclosure, coaxing beans and cucumbers from the earth. Even the sound of laughter, which had once seemed an act of disloyalty in those initial weeks, became more common, carried on the springtime air. Nevertheless, each act of generosity was accompanied by a sharp pang of guilt. "We are eating well," one woman confided in her diary, "while our families sift through rubble for mere breadcrumbs. How can this be considered just?" This inherent contradiction formed the core of their torment behind the wire. To accept clemency from the enemy was to concede that the narratives of their barbarity had been fabricated. To embrace comfort while their homeland faced destitution was to bear an immense weight of shame. And still, the gestures of comfort persisted. Local villagers contributed books, warm coverings, and even musical instruments. On some evenings, the compound resonated with the melodies of violins and harmonicas, played by inmates who recalled tunes from a different existence. The guards listened in quiet contemplation, perhaps recognizing in the music the faint echoes of their own distant hearths. While conflict manufactured adversaries, prolonged confinement fostered closeness, and closeness tended to soften distinctions. Upon Germany's capitulation in May, the camp responded not with jubilant shouts, but with a profound silence. The women congregated in small groups, perusing the official notice affixed to the gate, its English script painstakingly translated phrase by phrase. Hitler was deceased. The Reich had crumbled. For some, a wave of relief washed over them, intertwined with sorrow. For others, their skepticism solidified into a bitter resentment. A young auxiliary was overheard murmuring, "This cannot be true. We were assured of our invincibility." Yet, the truth bore down heavily. Their nation lay in ruins, their loved ones dispersed, and here they were, secure, nourished, and warm, within the territory of their adversaries. Letters began to arrive with agonizing slowness. One woman discovered that her residence in Cologne had been reduced to dust. Another learned of her mother's demise in an aerial assault. Many received no correspondence whatsoever. Throughout the nights, the barracks filled with suppressed weeping, grief seeping into the darkness. Yet, each morning, the mess hall still carried the aroma of freshly baked bread. The garden continued to flourish. And occasionally, when the church volunteers visited, there was still pie. The sweetness now carried a different quality. It was no longer merely startling. It was overwhelming in its tenderness. The ideological chasm had become complete. For years, these women had been informed that America was a land populated by fiends where brutality was rampant. But these perceived monsters had provided them with music, literature, hygiene supplies, and sustenance. These monsters had served them pie. For a multitude, this dissonance evolved into an enduring sorrow. Decades later, retrospective interviews with former prisoners of war revealed the profound depth of this internal conflict. "I found it impossible to reconcile," one woman confessed. "My hatred for our own leaders grew more intense than for the enemy. They deceived us, and the Americans provided undeniable proof with their butter and apples." Some of the women would eventually return to Germany once the war concluded, disembarking onto shores that bore the scars of countless bombings. They carried with them the indelible imprint of the camp, the fencing, the blankets, and the unexpected clemency. A remarkable few even chose to relocate to America years afterward, becoming immigrants, marrying, and establishing lives in the very nation where they had once been held captive. Their offspring grew up conversing in English, their homes often perfumed by the scent of pies cooling on window ledges. What had commenced as a tool of bitter irony transformed for them into a cherished custom of belonging, but even those who never returned could not erase it from their minds. The flavor persisted, lodged in their memories like a stubborn splinter. They recalled the tentative smiles of the volunteers, the solemn prayers of the chaplain, and the guards who averted their gaze as extra sugar was taken. They remembered the shame associated with enjoying such luxuries, the burden of surviving more comfortably than their families back home. They vividly recalled that during the war's most bleak winter, their adversaries had offered them solace when their own leaders had offered only deceit. The apple pie transcended its literal form, becoming a potent emblem. It symbolized the shattering of a fabricated narrative, the disintegration of a delusion. Within its sweetness lay the poignant sting of betrayal by their own government and the disorienting realization that humanity could exist even on the opposing side of a global conflict. It served as irrefutable evidence that America's most formidable weapon was not its arsenal of bombs or rifles, but its capacity to disarm through simple acts of goodwill. One captive artfully encapsulated this paradox in her personal writings. "The pie tasted of my childhood," she penned, "of security, of home. Yet it also tasted of defeat. I could not eat without envisioning my mother amidst the ruins. Still, I ate, for I could not refuse. And in that instant, I understood that the war was irrevocably lost, not due to armies, but because of the lie." Her words, hastily jotted in pencil, endured the censors and the passage of decades, a testament to the quiet transformation that had unfolded behind the barbed wire. When the final transport vessels ultimately conveyed them back across the Atlantic, the women cast one last look at the American coastlines. Some defiantly spat into the sea, vowing eternal condemnation upon their captors for the profound indignity of their compassion. Others shed silent tears, acknowledging they were departing a place where, despite its imposing fences, they had felt a greater sense of safety than they ever had under the oppressive shadow of the Reich. Each woman carried her unique interpretation of these memories, yet none could deny their profound influence. The flavor remained. Years later, within the kitchens of Germany, daughters would inquire about their mother's wartime experiences. And sometimes, when the subject proved too overwhelming, when the devastation and the losses felt too immense to articulate, the mothers would recount a different narrative. They would speak of the time the enemy offered them apple pie, and how it tasted like a profound act of mercy amidst the very heart of hell. The daughters would listen, filled with a sense of wonder, perhaps beginning to perceive the war not solely through the lens of destruction, but also through illuminating glimpses of shared humanity. The recollection of pie within a POW camp is a seemingly minor, almost whimsical detail against the vast canvas of a world at war. Yet, it is often in these small narratives that the most profound truths reside. For these women, the delectable combination of apples and sugar marked the precise moment when their established beliefs crumbled and objective reality asserted itself. They had anticipated cruelty and instead encountered benevolence. They had braced for deprivation and discovered nourishment. They had envisioned monstrous figures and found individuals, both men and women, possessing ordinary, compassionate hearts. Consequently, this legacy endures, whispered across generations. It is the enduring reminder that even amidst history's most harrowing conflict, a humble slice of apple pie served to both prisoners and captors alike as a potent reminder that even perceived enemies are, at their core, human. However, a more unsettling question lingers. If such profound compassion could breach the barbed wire barriers of warfare, what other fundamental beliefs might have been based on falsehoods? And what other possibilities might have been within reach all along?